Now, confidential Treasury analysis seen by the Fin Review, obtained under Freedom of Information, shows that high wages growth was actually the biggest driver of inflation in the June quarter last year. So much for profit gouging. Joining me now to discuss is macro business chief economist Leith Van Onselen. Leith, look, this is different from the regular message we're hearing from the government about what's keeping and what's made inflation so high. But it's so interesting that the Fin Review had to obtain this under FOI.
Yeah, look, I'll be honest, Sherry, I think the Treasury's actually got it wrong here. Look, Australian wages only grew by 0.1% more than headline inflation last year, and they're actually in line with underlying inflation. And it's important to note that Australia's wage growth is actually among the slowest in the developed world. So it's actually below the US, the UK and the Eurozone. And also Australian real wages, that's after you adjust for inflation, are tracking at around 2010 levels after falling about nearly 7% from their peak. So I think it's wrong for, the Australian Treasury to claim that wages are driving inflation when real wages actually fallen so sharply. That said, if wage growth does continue to strengthen from here, I think we could have a problem, and then that could start feeding into inflation. But I think that outcome's actually pretty unlikely because we've obviously got rising unemployment now and the labour market's weakening. So I think wage growth's actually going to slow anyway. So I don't agree with the Treasury on this analysis, I've got to say.
That's really interesting. So the Treasury clearly saying here that high wages growth, which has pushed the average full-time pay, they're saying over $100,000. They're saying this is the biggest driver of CPI, of inflation, into the year until June 2023. So, the government's line has been, and Jim Chalmers has been very successful in saying that he's getting wages growth moving again. It had been sluggish for well over the past decade. But you're actually saying that Treasury's got it wrong here. Why do you think that officials, why do you say that? Do you think Treasury isn't as credible as it once was?
No, it's absolutely not as credible. I mean, if this is the sort of garbage they're going to put out, they're completely talking through their backsides. I've got to be quite frank. And that's that full-time average earnings figure. If you actually look at ordinary average earnings, so that's not just full-time, that's part-time as well. That only went up 3.9% in the year, which was actually below inflation. So the fact of the matter is, Australian workers have seen their wages after inflation fall massively, nearly 7% from their peak. And they're tracking at 2010 levels. So they've gone backwards at a severe rate of knots. So for the Treasury then say that they're now responsible for inflation is appalling analysis. It's completely wrong. And I think it's there to distract from other issues, which I like to call elbow inflation, which is basically high energy inflation because we've got broken energy policy in this country, as well as obviously high housing inflation because the Albanese government's driving immigration through the moon, and it's basically driving up things like rents, which is pushing up inflation. So I think Treasury's just trying to basically distract here to bring heat away from the government, perhaps. I'm not sure what their motivation is, but it's definitely factually incorrect.
Very interesting. Now, just before you go, Australia has been warned by the United Nations that unless it adopts a climate-forward economic reform agenda, we're going to end up having entire populations trying to move to Australia. They're saying this is climate change migration. You've spoken a lot about immigration and the impact it's had on the economy, both positive and negative. What do you think of this warning from the UN?
Look, I don't know why they're going after Australia. I mean, I'll be quite honest. If Australia reduced its carbon emissions to zero tomorrow, it wouldn't move the needle globally at all. We're a tiny player in the world stage. And I think, shouldn't the UN be lecturing huge emitters like China, where emissions are, way larger than Australia's and they're growing almost exponentially, rather than Australia, where emissions are pretty flat. And once you, adjust for population growth, they're actually falling. So, I think the UN's targeting the wrong country here. That's my opinion, Sherry.